All righty. Doing the questions over Psalm 31 to Psalm 40. Good to be here this morning. Good to see everybody. Good to have my folks with us today. Mom and Dad and sister, they're up for Silas's birthday and my mama's birthday, kind of close together. So I guess kind of celebrating them together this week. But it's good to have them up with us here. All right, Psalm 31. The psalmist here is in dire distress. One of the psalms like that. But why is he in distress? In verse 10, he says, "My life is spent with grief, my years with sighing." Psalm 31:10. Why is that though? Because of his iniquity, because of his sin. That's right. So, and it's also because of his enemies as well. But sometimes the psalmist is in dire distress because of some things that he's done. He felt like God had forsaken him. In verse 22, he had said, "In haste, though, I am cut off before your eyes." So that tells you he realized God was with him all along. Bonus question, though, from Psalm 31. What part of this of Psalm 31, does Jesus quote on the cross? There you go. Hint. What is it? Verse 5, yeah. "Into thy hands I commit my spirit." That's right. There'll be another bonus question like that for another thing about Jesus. So there's several messianic things in these particular psalms. All right. In Psalm 32, who's the one who is blessed? He whose transgression is forgiven. The man whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. How did the psalmist feel before he expressed his iniquity, though? How did he feel before he expressed his sin? Yeah. He felt like he was dying. Yeah, his bones grew old. Yeah, through my groaning all the day long. Yep. Then he says, "I acknowledged my sin to you, and then you forgave the iniquity of my sin." All right. And Psalm 33 is a psalm about God's greatness, about his power, how we are to stand in awe of him. Sound a little familiar? This was actually our vacation Bible school psalm. And so in it he talks about God's goodness, God's power, God's sovereignty over the nations, and then his power to deliver. What do people look to for help, though, that's vain? Verses 16 through 17. Yeah, they look for the might. They look for the army, yeah, that's right. But they need to be looking to the greatness of God. Good. Psalm 34. Psalm about those who put their trust in the Lord. He says in verse 8, "O taste and see that the Lord is good." And then in verse 9, he talks about how we need to fear him and that we won't suffer any want. We won't lack any good thing. What sometimes lacks good things, though, he says, or suffers hunger? What are some things that do that? So the young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Yeah. That's right. Amen. All right. The other bonus question. Okay, what part of Psalm 34 was fulfilled at the cross about Jesus? Yep, verse 20, he guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. So how was that fulfilled at the cross? That's right. Who had their bone broke? That's right. The other two thieves. What they did was they went along and break their legs so that if they were still living, they'd suffocate to death, basically, because you'd fall under the weight that would do it. And if you were suspended from your hands like that and you didn't have your legs to push you up, you couldn't breathe anymore. So you just suffocate to death. So I heard, yeah. But they did not break Jesus' bones, and that fulfilled this passage right here. Psalm 35 is a what we call an imprecatory psalm. It's a psalm of pronouncing judgment on his enemies, how he wants God to bring to shame those who are his enemies. Who does he want to chase his enemies? I found this interesting. He wants somebody to chase his enemies. Verses 5 and 6. The angel of the Lord. That angel that led the people through the wilderness and all of those things. That great, powerful angel, he wanted them to chase his enemies. How did the psalmist, though, he's got these enemies that he's talking about here. He wants God to really get them, though. But he's not without love for his enemies. And what shows the love that he had for his enemies in this chapter? Yeah. So, verses 13 and 14, what did he do for his enemies? He mourned for them. When they were sick, what did he do? When he was sick, he was putting on sackcloth, fasting and praying for them. Verse 14, he paced about as though he were my friend or brother. And what this is doing, this is adding to how wicked the people are who are his enemies. They're being evil to him, but for no reason. David is saying, I've been nothing but good to these people. And they repay me for evil. Or they repay me with evil for all the good I've done. So you can see how he feels as though there's a great injustice that has been done to him, and he wants God to remedy that. Chapter 36 is a psalm about the wicked and partly about the wicked and their wickedness. What is not before their eyes, Chuck? They hadn't learned something. They hadn't learned. What did they not learn? Right. They hadn't been taught that. There's no fear of God before their eyes. We'll look at that in Romans today a little bit. Psalm 37. Psalm 37 is about how to not fret. Don't fret because of evildoers. If they look like they're rising up and they're real comfortable in their life, don't worry. God's going to repay them. There's a phrase, though, in Psalm 37 of inheriting the earth or inheriting the land. Who inherits the earth or inherits the land in Psalm 37? The humble. Yeah, the meek. And it's mentioned several times. Verse 9, who inherits the earth? Verse 9, those who wait on the Lord. In 29, it's the righteous that inherits the land. So he says that several times. But the wicked's going to be cut off from the land. You're going to wake up one day and you're not going to see the wicked man. He's going to pass away. All right, Psalm 38. It's a psalm of begging God not to chasten him. Once again, because of sin or some iniquity that he's done. He begins, O Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath. What are some statements in those first 8 verses about how he feels? How does he feel? Yeah. 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 Yep. Morning all day. Yeah, verse 7, my loins are full of inflammation, no soundness in my flesh. I mean, in just his whole soul and body, he felt cast down and overwhelmed. And on top of all of that, who stands afar off from him? Who doesn't pay any attention to him? His friends and his family. And so, basically says in verse 18, I will declare my iniquity, and I will be in anguish over my sin. And he begs God not to forsake him and be far from him. Okay. Yeah. 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 Well, we ought to do what the psalmist did, and that was we ought to talk about it. We ought to pray about it. We ought to cast those things on the Lord, and that's what the psalmist is doing. You know, he says, "I will declare my iniquity. I'll be, you know, I'm going to go through. I'm going to feel these things, but I'm going to cast them on the Lord and pray that the Lord helps me." So, yeah, Psalm 39. The psalmist he's trying to guard his tongue so he won't sin. And his heart burns within him. But then he finally speaks. And what does he say? It's pretty great words, what he says when he speaks. Verse 4, what does he say? Psalm 39. Yeah. Basically, when he finally does speak, he goes on talking about how he wants God to remind him how frail he is and how fleeting his life is, and how before God, when God corrects a person because of iniquity in verse 11, you know, he makes man like vapor, you know. And then Psalm 40. Psalm 40. We're out of time, but I'll just ask about Psalm 40. There's a passage in here about Jesus, that's quoted in the book of Hebrews about Christ. Do y'all know what that one is? Has to do with sacrifices. Yep. But in verse 7, then I said, behold, I come, in the scroll of the book it is written, I delight to do your will, O God. And in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer quotes that as Jesus saying that. God's saying, I don't desire sacrifices and offerings for sin. And so Jesus says, I'm going to do your will. I'm going to be the perfect sacrifice. So, yeah, very good. Okay, good deal. We're on lesson 5 in our book talking about the conquest. Lesson 5, talking about the conquest on Bible Timeline. And let's go to our Heavenly Father in a word of prayer. Keith, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer, please? Amen. Okay. All right. So, Deuteronomy 30, we're going to be starting over there today in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And we're looking at the conquest today. And we left off last Wednesday. Let's see, my clicker's not working. Clicker's not working. Is there anybody up there? Blake? Clicker ain't working. That's all it is. Maybe it is. There we go. Advance then. Yeah, there we go. Deuteronomy 30. And we're just continuing along in the story about God's people and how they're now going to conquer the promised land. It's been a long time in fulfillment of God bringing the people into the land that He swore to Abraham. And now they're on the borders of Canaan for a second time, or they're still wandering in the wilderness, but they're about to be on the borders here, going into the land of Canaan. And in the book of Deuteronomy, God is reiterating the law to them and getting another generation ready to go in and possess the promised land. And in Deuteronomy 30, He's out two choices of how that's going to go. God's going to give them the land, but what they do in the land and how prosperous they are is up to them. And so He gives them a warning about going into that land. Somebody read Deuteronomy 30, 19 through 20. Right. So what did He set before them? Free will. Yeah. Life and death, blessing and cursing. And by the way, Deuteronomy 28, there were actual curses that are pronounced. Basically, there's these blessings and cursings that they're supposed to iterate on these two mountains when they go in and possess the land, so that they would know, here's the choice. Here's the choice of free will that I have as I'm going into this land, of whether or not I'm going to be successful. And whether or not they were going to be successful in this endeavor was going to be up to their whether they obeyed God or not and did His will. And that, so what Moses is placing great weight in reiterating this law to them. Now, as they went into the land, there were specific instructions of battle that was given to them, and this would be part, one point where they would either rise or fall. This would either do them in, or they would be greatly blessed, whether or not they followed these instructions. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 5, someone read those specific instructions there. This is really key. Yeah. So sum that up, Jim, what do they do to them? Wipe them off the face of the earth. Why? Because they'll turn them. That's right. They'll turn them to serve their gods. Don't make any covenant with them. No marriages with them. And later on in Deuteronomy 20, he gets more specific about that. He makes it clear in Deuteronomy 20 that he's not talking about all of the nations they're going to encounter. He's talking about just these 7 nations that are in the land of Canaan. People that are outside of that domain, you could make covenants of peace with them if they so choose. But it's these people in the land that are, he said, don't let them live amongst you. All right? How y'all think Israel's going to do about following this command? They ain't going to do very good. And that's going to be one of the areas of their great downfall. Now, they got a new leader. They got a new leader as they go in and possess the land. Moses is going to die, and he's not going to be able to enter the promised land. And why wasn't Moses able to go in? Yeah, struck it twice when God told him to speak. And so there's a new leader that raises up Joshua to go in and help the people possess the land. And he does. They go in and they begin conquering the land with Joshua. And what were some of the first cities, just kind of thinking about when they went in and they started conquering the land with Joshua's help, what were some of the first places that they conquered? Jericho and Ai. Yeah, there were 2. Now, yeah, that's right. 3 battles to get 2 cities. And why was that, Jim? A sin in the camp. That's right. Remember, old Achan, he went into Jericho as they were burning down Jericho, because that's what they did with the city. They burned it down. And old Achan couldn't help himself, could he? Couldn't help himself. He saw some gold and a Babylonian garment. He said, oh, I got to have that. And so he took it and he hid it, and his sin found him out. Several people died going in that first battle to Ai, but they ended up conquering Ai, and they just went on. Remember, in that battle, when we'll talk about the Gibeonites here in just a minute, but in that great battle, you remember when Joshua went and defeated all those kings that went against the Gibeonites, because they had made a covenant with them, and they cried out to him, please help us. And so all of the kings of the land are coming, and God causes the sun to stand still, and you have all of those cities and that southern portion of Canaan on that map. And then they conquer that southern portion first, and then they move north, and really the book of Joshua outlines that conquest as they're going out. But there's the beginning of, I'm going to call it the beginning of trouble. That's kind of how I put it in the book, because God made a covenant of with the people, but they ended up making a covenant with the Gibeonites. But it wasn't like they did it willingly. What happened? Y'all tell me about that. Joshua 9. They were tricked. How'd they get tricked? Yeah. Yep. That's right. Yeah. And according to the law in Deuteronomy, if they were from a far-off nation desiring peace with them, what were they to do? It's okay. It's okay to be at peace with them. And so as far as the Israelites concerned, they were making a covenant of peace with a foreign nation, with far-off nation, but it didn't take very long before the people figured out they were their neighbors, next-door neighbors, not very far off from from Ai and Jericho. And so the people were furious with Joshua and with the leaders. Why did you let this happen? And of course, they ended up not killing them, but they made them their servants, water carriers and so forth, and carrying burdens for the house of God, for the tabernacle and such, and helping out with some things, carrying certain burdens. And so these people, it's kind of like a catch-22. Joshua, they all felt bad in their conscience. They didn't want to kill him because they made a covenant of peace with him. So they decided to let him live. But through this chain of events, you now have this first nation, or this first sub-nation, I guess, these first sub-peoples of the land that they made a covenant with. And the problem is that it isn't gonna necessarily stop there. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yeah. Don't marry them. Don't. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. Yeah, he could have stopped there, but he's telling them why. Well, they're going to make them. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. That's right. And Joshua 9, they did not do that concerning the Gibeonites. That's right. Yep. Yep, even old Joshua jumped the gun on that. They did not ask the Lord for counsel, and that got them. Yep. So they have this covenant, but I mean, Joshua, all in all, I mean, during the time of Joshua, it's one of the most glorious times in all of Israel's history. It really is. I mean, they greatly conquer the land. They go in and they're wiping people out, like God said. They're destroying them. We're going to see in the book of Judges how that wasn't always so. But in Joshua 23, verses 11 through 13, this is after they've been conquering the land for some time. Joshua knows. He knows what the people are up against, and he knows what's in their hearts too. He's been with these people for a long time. And in Joshua 23 and 24, Joshua gives really this farewell speech to them and this warning to them about you're going to continue to dwell in this and possess this land. Make sure you follow the Lord. Make sure you do what He says, because if you don't, then God's not going to be with you. In Joshua 23, verses 11 through 13, I find it interesting. This is kind of pertinent to what we've been talking about the nations and driving the nations out and utterly destroying them. Joshua 23, 11 through 13. Somebody read that. Keep on, finish up verse 13. All right. Notice there's something very important here in this verse. It wasn't just a failure to completely destroy the nations that was the problem. It was why they didn't want to destroy the nations. That was the real problem. He says, if you cling to these nations, in other words, if you desire to have them among you, you cling to them, then notice how that just compounds the problem. It isn't just that they wouldn't destroy the nations because of their own hearts. It's that God wouldn't be with them in doing that. It would be, in other words, the closer in their hearts they clung to these nations, the harder it would be to get rid of them. The harder it would be to get rid of them. Now, if they wanted to do what God said, God was going to be with them and destroy them. But part of what's working in all of this is God's care and God's providence with them and His strength with them to give them the power to drive out these people and utterly destroy them. He says, if you cling to them, though, I'm no longer going to drive out these nations before you, and then they're going to be a snare to you. And, you know, the people, after Joshua said all these things, and later on Joshua 24, you know, he says those great words, you know, choose this day whom you'll serve. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. Remember that? What did people say? You remember what the people said? We're going to do it. Now, that was true for the people that said that, because how long did they serve God? For generations. Yeah, they after Joshua died, and then who else? After who else? The elders that outlived Joshua, they served him. But then we're in the book of Judges, and that starts changing, doesn't it? We go to the book of Judges, and that starts changing. The book of Judges opens up with continued conquest of the land. Judah is highlighted in some things that they do. They go up in verse 17 with their brother Simeon, and it talks about some of their conquests that they did, their successes. However, starting in verse 27, you begin to see a pattern unfold. Yes? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And any failure on their part or any negative consequence would not be the result of God's lack of care. It would be their own blunder. God had done everything, and more so of what He said that He was going to do. God had been a good God. However, the people weren't going to be a good people. And starting in verse 27 in the book of Judges, we find a pattern that starts emerging. Somebody read verses 27 through 30. We don't have to finish the whole chapter, but somebody read 27 through 30 of Judges 1, and you'll get the picture of what's going on here. Yeah. So you see a pattern emerging there. They don't drive them out. Instead, what do they do with them? Forced labor, put them under tribute, basically using them, for service and so forth. And later on, God appears to him and he tells them, The angel of the Lord comes and tells them, look, it's because you, in your hearts, you wanted to be among these nations and make covenants with them, that I hadn't been driving them out before you. And that started a long spiral down in the book of Judges. The whole book of Judges is going to be about how, because they didn't drive out these people, this very thing happened. They married amongst them, they made covenants with them, and then that led to their downfall. That led to idolatry. That led to sin. But you know, God was with them when they cried out for help, and that's why the book of Judges is called the book of Judges, because when the people messed up and their enemies overtook them and they cried out to God for help, what did God do? Yep. Yep. That's right. Gave them a deliverer. Gave them a deliverer, gave them a judge. And we'll talk more about this in a moment in the questions. We'll look at some of those judges. But, I mean, just from one end to the other, in the book of Judges, you just got this cycle of sin and then the consequences and them crying out to the Lord and Him delivering them. And then they're good for a little while, but then they fall back into old habits. And it just seems to get worse and worse all the way to the end of the book of Judges. And it's just horrible. I mean, you can't even recognize these people anymore as God's people. They're so bad. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that to happen. Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. Yep. Hmm. Yep. It got a little bit worse. Yep. Mm. Mm. Yep. That's right. It's tough. Yeah, it is. We'll talk more about that in the questions here. Let's get to the questions. We don't have much time left. Um, just 10 questions here. How many kings did Joshua conquer? In Joshua 12 and verse 24. Huh? 31. 31. Yep. What people tricked Israel into making a covenant with them? Gibeonites. All right. List the names of all the tribes of Israel that received land on the west side of the Jordan. On the west side of the Jordan. Okay. Zebulun, Asher. Yeah. Naphtali, Dan. Did someone say Ephraim? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. And of course, I'm sorry, there were several at one time where it's where Jerusalem is. Which one was that? He kind of became, yeah, Judah. Yep. Sorry, there were several things coming at me one time. It's hard to hear all that. I think y'all got them, though. I think y'all got them. What about the east side now? There was 3 on the east side of Jordan. Half tribe of Manasseh. Yeah, Manasseh had a portion, pretty great portion of land on both sides. What was a city of refuge and what were their names? What was a city of refuge? Hmm. That's right. That's right. So the people that went to these cities of refuge, could they go there if it was a premeditated murder? No. They might go there, but they would be judged and they would be delivered over to the... Yep. Yep. That's right. And how long was he to remain there? Till the death of the high priest. That's right. So there was a time period where they would serve their sentence there for what we would call manslaughter. Manslaughter, not premeditated murder, but some kind of unpremeditated murder, accidental death or so forth. And so yeah. What were the 6 cities of refuge then? There were 3 on the east, 3 on the west, and they were positioned strategically. They're spread out pretty much in equal portions. Kadesh, Shechem, and Hebron. So Kadesh, north, middle is Shechem. Hebron is the south and the far south. Then on the east side, what do you got? Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan. Yep, Ramoth of Gilead. Right there on the border. Right there next to Ammon. Really, some of these on the east were right on the border between Israel's possessions and Ammon, the possession of Ammon. Alrighty. How long did the people remain faithful after Joshua's death? Yep. There you go. So we've only got like 1 minute left, and we didn't talk about this one book. So, because I wanted to get to it in the questions. But somebody tell me what the book of Ruth is about. And when did the book of Ruth, when did that story happen? Yep. So it was during the days of the judges. And what's Ruth about? Yep. Gives us a genealogy.